Welcome back to the U.S. Navy History Podcast. I am Dale, and I'm joined by Christoph.
Wow, what an intro. Thank you, Dale. I feel welcome and encouraged all at once. Hello, listener. Thank you for joining us, and I'm excited to see what's on the docket today.
When most people think of the Battle of the Atlantic, they picture gold gray seas, convoy battles off Newfoundland, and destroyers battling U-boats in the North Atlantic. They don't picture palm trees. They don't picture turquoise water.
Ooh.
And they certainly don't picture oil refineries burning in the Caribbean night.
I didn't picture any of that stuff. Sorry, continue.
But in February 1942, the war came to Aruba. And when it did, it exposed just how vulnerable America's energy lifeline truly was. To understand the attack, we need to understand one thing. Oil was war. Aircraft, ships, tanks, all of it ran on fuel. And in 1942, one of the most important fuel sources in the Western Hemisphere was not Texas. It was Aruba.
Aruba, really?
The tiny Dutch island sat just north of Venezuela, strategically positioned near major oil fields. But, more importantly, it housed the Lago Oil and Transport Company refinery, one of the largest and most productive refineries in the world. At the start of 1942, Lago Refinery processed Venezuelan crude into high-octane aviation gasoline. Some historians estimate that a significant percentage of Allied aviation fuel came from Caribbean refineries, like Aruba and nearby Curaçao. If those refineries stopped producing, Allied air operations could suffer dramatically. And Germany knew this. By early 1942, German U-boats were operating aggressively along the American East Coast during what became known as... You remember this?
East Coast submarine, World War II, target-rich environment, the Troubles. No?
The second happy time.
I did know that. You were right. But not fast enough.
But the campaign didn't stop there. German Naval Command launched Operation Neuland, a coordinated submarine offensive into the Caribbean. The goal was clear: destroy oil production, sink tankers, cripple Allied logistics. The Caribbean until then had felt distant from the war. That illusion was about to end. In the early hours before dawn, a German submarine, U-156, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Werner Hartenstein, approached Aruba. The sea was calm. The island was quiet. Most of the population was asleep. The refinery lights glowed in the distance, a beacon in the dark. Hartenstein had two primary targets: tankers anchored offshore and the Lago refinery itself. The attack began just after midnight. U-156 fired torpedoes at anchored oil tankers near San Nicolas Harbor. The results were immediate and devastating. The tanker USS Pedernales was hit and erupted into flames. The British tanker SS Oranjestad was struck and badly damaged. Another vessel, the Arkansas, was hit as well. Massive fireballs lit the night sky. Burning oil spread across the water. Sailors scrambled for lifeboats as explosions echoed across the harbor. For the people of Aruba, the war had arrived in a blaze of orange fire. But Hartenstein was not finished. In a rare and risky maneuver, U-156 surfaced and attempted to shell the Lago refinery with its deck gun. The idea was simple. If torpedoes sank ships, artillery could cripple production. The submarine maneuvered into position. The crew prepared the deck gun. They fired. And then something unexpected happened. The gun crew had forgotten to remove the muzzle cover before firing.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
The result was catastrophic for the submarine's weapon. The deck gun malfunctioned violently, injuring crew members and rendering the gun temporarily unusable. In the confusion and darkness, U-156 withdrew. The refinery, remarkably, remained largely intact. It was one of the strangest and most consequential mistakes in the entire Atlantic War. Had the refinery been significantly damaged, Allied fuel production could have suffered serious disruption in early 1942, a critical moment when the war's outcome was still uncertain. Instead, Aruba survived. But the message was clear. Nowhere was safe. Not the American coastline, not the Caribbean, not even a small island refinery thousands of miles from Europe.
So I am fascinated by this. There's so many things here that I want to pick apart. This is brand new, except for submarines attacking Americans or allies. That's not new. We've talked about that. One, I never understood that Aruba was such a vital pipeline of aviation fuel or fuel generally. It makes sense with its proximity to Venezuela, and we know Venezuela has a lot of oil reserves, so that makes sense. But this is, again, one of those things that I did not learn in school when talking about World War II. But certainly it helps make this conflict more global, right? The major powers are just going to various countries around the world and, hey, oh, you're helping them? All right, I guess we're targeting you now. And so it goes. That's what's happening.
World War means world war.
Yeah, absolutely. And to think that you're a fifth-generation Aruba resident and you're asleep in your residence and all of a sudden there's an explosion in the harbor, I'm sure that doesn't happen at all. Like, it's very rare. But I suppose when you're helping one side of a global conflict with their fuel production, that's bound to happen. Yeah, this is great. Please keep going.
When the first torpedoes struck, Aruba did not wake up all at once. It woke in pieces. A concussion, a flash of orange against the horizon, windows rattling. Then the unmistakable sound of secondary explosions. The USS Pedernales was torn open by a torpedo strike. Flames shot skyward as fuel ignited instantly. The ship did not sink immediately. Her crew fought desperately to contain the fire. The British tanker Orgenstad was also hit, severely damaged, and she later had to be scuttled. Other vessels were damaged or set ablaze. Burning oil drifted across the harbor. Sailors leapt into water coated in fuel.
Ooh.
Some swam through flames. Others clung to wreckage in darkness lit only by fire. It was confusion, but also discipline. Because merchant sailors were used to danger. At the Lago refinery, workers initially believed the explosions might be an industrial accident. When the artillery shells began landing, even though the U-156's deck gun malfunctioned early, a few shells were fired towards refinery installations and struck storage tanks. Workers scattered, then regrouped. Emergency crews moved towards threatened areas. Fire suppression systems were activated. Damage was assessed almost immediately. Here's what's remarkable. Despite the shock, refinery operations did not collapse. Within days, in some cases hours, production resumed.
Wow.
That mattered enormously. At the time of the attack, Aruba was under Dutch administration, but the United States had deployed troops to defend critical Caribbean infrastructure after Pearl Harbor. Still, defenses were limited. Coastal artillery was not yet fully prepared. Anti-submarine patrols were sparse, and radar coverage was incomplete. Operation Neuland exposed that vulnerability. The Caribbean had been viewed as strategically important, but not immediately threatened. That illusion ended on February 16th, 1942. Now, casualties from the attack were real, but given the scale of fires, could have been far worse. Several sailors were killed, others were injured by explosions and burns. For a small island community, even a handful of deaths carried enormous weight. Aruba's population was tightly knit. Refinery workers, sailors, families connected to the oil industry. Overnight, their island was no longer a distant support point in a global war. It was a front line. Perhaps the most powerful effect of the attack was psychological. The Caribbean had been seen as safe, almost serene compared to the North Atlantic. Now, residents saw black smoke on the horizon and heard the echo of naval gunfire. The idea that German submarines could strike so close, so boldly, was sobering. Across the Caribbean, alarms went up. If Aruba could be attacked, so could Trinidad. So could the Panama Canal approaches. The war had expanded. From the German side, the attack was considered tactically successful. Several tankers were damaged or destroyed. Shipping was disrupted. Fear was injected into Allied planning. But the failure to cripple the refinery itself was a strategic disappointment. Had the Largo refinery been knocked offline for months, the ripple effects could have been significant. Instead, production continued, and Germany would soon discover that provoking the United States in the Western Hemisphere carried consequences.
So I got a question. When you mentioned, I meant to ask this earlier, apologies, but here we are, we're doing it now. You mentioned the deck gun of the submarine had the muzzle cover on. Now, when I think of a deck gun on a submarine, I only think of like a machine gun. Yes, you're shaking your head no. For the listener, he's, yes, telling me I'm wrong. No problem. What kind of gun is mounted on the submarine? What deck gun capabilities did these guys have?
So it depends on the size of the boat. The Type 7 boats, which were the most common, carried a 8.8 centimeter SK C-35 naval deck gun, firing a 12 to 14 kilogram round with a 9 kilogram warhead. Larger boats, the Type 1, the 9 and 10, had a more powerful 10.5 centimeter 45 naval gun. And these were standard on U-boats from the very beginning. Later in the war, they would add anti-aircraft guns because at the later part of the war, the U-boats were being detected en masse because air cover was more prevalent because we were able to expand the range of our planes. Sonar and radar got better throughout the war, so U-boats were targeted very successfully. And so the deck gun was mounted forward of the sail or conning tower, and I believe the anti-aircraft gun was aft of the conning tower.
That's incredible, because I imagine they don't cover them up or anything when they submerge, right? They're just out.
That's what the plug is for.
Oh, okay.
They
Makes
put
sense.
in the plug to protect the interior of the barrel
Yeah.
and the firing mechanism from the
Okay.
salt water.
Perfect. That's exactly. You answered my question. Excellent. Okay. This is nuts. I can't believe that they could have really devastated that supply of fuel. And I'm just thinking of the ripple effects that you were talking about. Uh, Less fuel means fewer sorties, which means less engagement, which means more dominance of the axis in the air, which ultimately means more dominance of axis on the ground. This could have been devastating, but just the chance, because they didn't take the cork off the gun, it wasn't as bad. Also, the number of casualties you mentioned, they were there were a few, and I say that relatively speaking because we've talked about many battles where there have been hundreds or thousands. I'm sure Aruba's hospital capacity is not super great because they're building to accommodate what normally would happen. But if this refinery were to have gone up in flames and just the people involved trying to suppress the fire or that just caught up just because it was late at night, that could have really overwhelmed the hospital, anyway, this could have been so much worse. And all it did really was alert the Allies that, hey, this is a vulnerability and you should move to make sure this doesn't happen again.
I mean,
Uh,
it also took out some very expensive boats.
oh, yes, that's true. I don't want to overlook that. And then you mentioned, I think it was the British ship with the very hard to pronounce name, Orange Stadt or
Yeah,
something.
I'm sure I got it wrong.
I wasn't even going to try it. But anyway, you said they scuttled the ship. They wouldn't do that in the harbor, would they? Or how does that happen?
It depends on its position and whether they have the resources to actually tow it to a more favorable place to scuttle it.
I would think if they scuttled it in the harbor, it could be a hazard for shipping,
It
right?
depends on the depth of the harbor.
Oh, yeah, I guess if you're a Caribbean island, maybe you have deep harbors.
Like with Pearl Harbor, for example, it's a very shallow harbor. So a boat
True,
going down there will disrupt things. But then
right.
there's also deep water harbors where you have 80 feet of clearance
Oh,
from the sea floor to the surface. A boat going down
okay.
there is not going to disrupt travel,
I see.
shipping.
Okay.
Now, the environmental impact on
Oh,
that harbor is completely different.
oh yeah. Burning oil all over the place and sunken ships and whatever the contents of the ships were, ammunition and ooh, that's pretty rough.
But I'm
And so
sure
this
in this case, it was probably towed to a more safer location and then scuttled.
okay, that makes sense. And just to be clear, this was one submarine that did all of this?
Yep.
That's amazing. That is a lot of devastation to happen from one ship. Wow. Imagine if there were two or three. There are so many things that could have made this so much worse. Anyway, yes, please continue. I want to hear more.
The attack on Aruba was not an isolated strike. It was part of something much larger. In February 1942, like I mentioned earlier, Germany launched Operation Neuland. It was a coordinated submarine offensive into the Caribbean basin. The objective was simple: cripple Allied oil production, destroy tanker traffic, and expand the Atlantic War into America's backyard. By early 1942, German Naval Command understood something critical. The Caribbean was the fuel tank of the Allied war effort. Refineries at Aruba and Curacao processed Venezuelan crude into aviation gasoline, which was the lifeblood of Allied aircraft. Tankers carried refined fuel north to the United States and across the Atlantic to Britain. Without Caribbean oil, Allied air operations would slow. Without tankers, the logistical chain would fracture. The region was a high value target and lightly defended. Several submarines participated in Operation Neuland, including the before mentioned U-156, the U-502, the U-67, and the U-129. They struck almost simultaneously across the southern Caribbean. Tankers were torpedoed near Curacao. Ships were sunk off Venezuela. Traffic was disrupted near Trinidad. In just days, the Caribbean, once considered relatively secure, became a contested war zone. The attacks created immediate confusion. Shipping routes were thrown into disarray. Refinery operators worried about sustained bombardment. Local governments scrambled to coordinate defenses. The U.S. Navy was still heavily committed to the East Coast crisis, and now had to stretch resources even further south. There were not enough escort vessels. There were not enough aircraft. There were not enough anti-submarine crews. The war was expanding faster than America could initially respond. Germany's strategy was bold but risky. Submarines operating in the Caribbean were far from European bases, which meant supply was difficult. Escape routes were limited, and air cover was non-existent. But in early 1942, the gamble paid off. Tankers burned, shipping insurance skyrocketed. Convoy systems had yet to be fully implemented in the region. The Atlantic War had become global. The United States Navy reacted quickly, though not instantly. Convoy systems were expanded into the Caribbean, air patrols were intensified, and naval bases in places like Trinidad and Guantanamo increased activity. Coastal blackouts were implemented. Harbor defenses were strengthened. Within months, what had been an easy hunting ground became far more dangerous for U-boats. The pattern mirrored the East Coast experience. Initial shock, painful losses, rapid adaptation. Operation Neuland did not cripple Caribbean oil production, but it forced the United States to recognize a hard truth. There were no peripheral theaters. Every sea lane mattered. Every refinery mattered. Every tanker mattered. The Atlantic War was not confined to cold northern waters. It stretched from the Arctic to the equator, and Aruba had become one of its flashpoints.
That's when you talk about how broad the scope of all these attacks were, everything that the U.S. Navy had to cover from a defensive perspective. I can see why it was so critical to pursue the intelligence angle, because you can't be everywhere at once. And even though America did ramp up its manufacturing significantly to try to cover this, still, even then, there are so many targets, so many difficulties in trying to protect against attacks like this, that you would need that extra added benefit of knowing what they're planning. And so I can see why that was such a successful component there. This might be a silly question, but when has that ever stopped me before?
Never.
Yes. So the submarine in question that kicked this off, U-156, you listed several other submarines in the area, all starting with U's and ending with numbers. Did the Germans just not name the submarines? Or further, do any nations name their submarines? Because I know I'm familiar with the Bismarck was a German ship, a battleship. So they do name ships, but every time we've talked about the submarine aspect of warfare against allies, they're sinking the Pedernales, for example, or the Arkansas, ships with names, but the submarines themselves have designations. Is it just because they were making so many of them that it wasn't part of the process, or I'm just curious about that?
I believe Germany has always just used whole numbers for their naming scheme. The U.S. did use actual names for their submarines. They did eventually be ranking out so many, they also just went to whole numbers.
Mm-hmm.
But typically, American boats all have names.
Okay. That's wild. Thank you for engaging that curiosity. The other thing I had a question about was when you're talking about coastal blackouts. So we had talked about this in a previous episode where on the east coast of America, coastal cities would turn their lights off so they wouldn't be inviting targets for submarines, very much like this situation. Every time I've driven past a refinery, which it's been a couple of times, I've seen several, they are lit up like a Christmas tree. Like you cannot avoid them. And they have that eerie orange glow. I don't know if they did back then, but they certainly do now. Would they shut that down too, I imagine? Because that's super bright. But then also, I imagine it's on always just for a safety perspective because they're constantly running.
Yeah, it's called light discipline. You shut them off.
I see. Man,
Not
okay.
only are you, the whole reason of shutting off your lights, going dark, doing light discipline is twofold. One, from the air. If you have bright lights going on, you're painting a target on you.
Right.
And also from the sea, not only for artillery, but also you're lighting up the ships in the harbor.
Oh,
Because now you have actual silhouettes you can aim at.
that makes sense.
Because typically at night, your boat is not going to be lit up. Even now, you have navigation lights, you have minimal lighting, just enough to be identified that, hey, I'm here.
That makes sense. Wow, this is, I feel like I'm learning so much. Okay, thank you. Please continue with the unfolding of the story.
In February 1942, exposed the Caribbean's vulnerability. The months that followed demonstrated something else: American adaptation. The U-boat attacks on Aruba and across the Caribbean were a wake-up call, and the United States Navy, already learning hard lessons off the East Coast, applied them quickly. One of the most immediate changes was the expansion of the convoy system into the Caribbean. Tankers no longer sailed alone. Ships bound for Venezuelan oil fields to Aruba, from Aruba to the Gulf Coast, from the Caribbean to the North Atlantic. They now moved in escorted groups. Destroyers, patrol craft, and smaller escort vessels guarded them through dangerous waters. It wasn't perfect. Losses continued. But the era of easy sinkings was ending. The Caribbean sky filled with patrol aircraft. U.S. Navy and Army Air Forces began systemic anti-submarine patrols from bases in Puerto Rico, Trinidad, Guantanamo Bay, Aruba, and Curacao. Aircraft armed with depth charges and equipped with radar extended the Allies' reach far beyond the coastline. For U-boat commanders, the warm Caribbean surface, once inviting, became a liability. Surfacing in daylight was increasingly dangerous. The U.S. military rapidly expanded its presence throughout the region. Airfields were lengthened. Fuel storage was fortified. Coastal artillery batteries were strengthened. Aruba itself became more heavily defended. Anti-aircraft guns appeared around the refinery. Harbor defenses improved, and military personnel increased. The island was no longer an exposed industrial outpost. It was a defended, strategic asset. Perhaps most impressive was the refinery's resilience. Despite the attack, the Lago facility continued operating. Repairs were swift. Security increased. Production remained steady. The very thing Germany had hoped to cripple, Allied fuel supply, continued flowing. In fact, Caribbean refineries would go on to support massive Allied operations in North Africa and Europe. Oil from Aruba ultimately fueled aircraft flying over Normandy. That's how connected this small island was to the broader war. As 1942 progressed, German submarines operating in the Caribbean faced increasing danger. Air patrol forced them to submerge more frequently. Convoys made attacks riskier, and escort vessels hunted aggressively. The early success of Operation Neuland gave way to diminishing returns. The Caribbean was no longer a soft target. The learning curve that had been so costly in 1942 now worked in the Allies' favor. By 1943, as the broader Battle of the Atlantic turned decisively against Germany, the Caribbean campaign faded from prominence. Not because it was unimportant, but because it had been secured. The oil kept flowing, the tankers kept sailing, the U-boats withdrew or were destroyed. Aruba had endured its trial and remained standing.
That's why it gets the first name in the Kokomo song. It's that important. Did you know that?
I do now.
Yes. See, this is an exchange of information and ideas, and it's not often that I get to educate you, but I feel like I've done that. But anyway, again, this happens almost every episode, but just I marvel at the adaptability of the American military and specifically the Navy. When this was exposed as a threat at the beginning of the story, that had to have been such a concerning situation for the leadership. How are we going to cover this? How are we going to protect this vital component of our infrastructure, of the overall military effort from the enemy? And they did. They did with production, technology, better discipline and routine, and then intelligence. And they eventually pushed back the submarine threat. I just find that I know we've spoken in the past about when during the U.S. Civil War, when the North tried to blockade the coastline of the South, and that was just such a monumental task because the South has a very long Atlantic coastline. It was difficult. They had very few ships. There were lots of privateer-ish runners that would get through, and that was quite a challenge. And you can see just, let me see, 40, 50, 60 years later, not even 60 years later, we have an even broader scope that the Americans have to handle, and they're able to do so. They're able to coordinate the efforts of industry and personnel and even foreign powers. You said the folks in Aruba were ramping up their security for the refinery and whatnot. This is a tightly coordinated effort that was very successful. And I think, and I am blown away by, they see the threat, they make a plan, they execute the plan, moving on to the next thing.
History often records dates, tonnage sunk, and operational names. But on Aruba, February 16th, 1942 was not an operation. It was a night people remembered by the color of the sky. For the crews aboard the tankers, survival was immediate and physical. Men thrown from bunks by explosions, deck plates splitting under their feet, fire racing across oil-slicked water. Some sailors swam through burning fuel. Others were rescued by small harbor craft that pushed into smoke and debris to pull survivors from the water. Many of these men were not career naval personnel. They were merchant marines, engineers, deckhands, radio operators, doing dangerous work in a war zone. Their names rarely make headlines, but without them, the Allied war machine stops. At Lago, thousands worked around the clock refining crude oil into aviation gasoline. When the shells landed and the tankers burned, some workers ran towards the danger, not away from it. Emergency response teams contained fires. Engineers inspected vulnerable storage tanks. Supervisors coordinated with Dutch authorities and American military personnel. The refinery was not a strategic asset. It was livelihood, community, identity, and they protected it. Aruba in 1942 was a multicultural island. Dutch administrators, Caribbean locals, refinery workers from across the Americas and Europe. The attack unified them under a single realization. They were now participants in a global war. Children saw the glow of burning ships reflected in the water. Families listened to distant explosions and waited for news. For a small island community, the psychological impact was enormous. War was no longer a headline from Europe. It was offshore. Those killed in the attack were mourned quietly. The Atlantic had claimed more lives. For merchant families, thousands of miles away, telegrams arrived bearing grim news. In wartime, even distant waters carry grief home. Today, Aruba remembers the attack as a defining moment in its wartime history. Memorials and historical markers honor those who died. The Lago refinery, though no longer operating as it once did, remains central to the island's identity. The attack is not remembered as defeat. It is remembered as resilience. Because the refinery survived, production continued, the island endured. In the grand scale of World War II, the attack on Aruba was a small engagement, but its implications were large. It demonstrated that the Atlantic War had no geographic limits. It proved that energy infrastructure was a strategic target, and it showed that rapid adaptation, military and civilian, could blunt even a bold enemy strike.
That's well said. I think one of my favorite parts about doing this show is understanding the smaller stories and the personal impact to those directly involved, and then also how that fits into the broader scheme of whatever conflict or situation we're talking about. Again, this is not an aspect that I learned about. I thought the Caribbean was completely untouched, frankly, from a World War II perspective. I didn't see how they would be involved. But this exposes my ignorance and helps me to correct that information. And not only that, but how Aruba's refinery was so impactful to the war effort, the Allied war effort in general, and how people from all over the world were working in that refinery to make that happen. And it's incredible. I don't know. Just the interconnectedness of it all just really is astonishing to me. And as a person who's played a lot of Axis and Allies on a board game, yes, I've played it. The Caribbean doesn't usually get involved. This is significant. And maybe next time I play, I'll change my strategy. We'll see. Maybe not.
You'll choose Aruba as your starting point?
You don't really get to choose your starting point, but I'm going to make a mad dash for Aruba, and then I'm going to have to pause the game and explain the implications of why that's such a key component and why they shouldn't get as many units. Anyway, it's going to be a thing. I'll report later how it goes.
Okay. The attack on Aruba was not just a dramatic night in February 1942. It was a strategic signal, a signal about energy, a signal about vulnerability, and a signal about the future of naval warfare. World War II was the first truly mechanized global conflict. Ships burned fuel oil. Aircrafts required high-octane aviation gasoline. Armies moved on petroleum. Aruba's Largo refinery was not just industrial infrastructure. It was combat power in liquid form. The German decision to target the Caribbean refineries showed a clear understanding. Destroy the fuel, and you weaken the fleet. Destroy the supply chain, and you slow the war machine. This logic has not changed. Modern naval planners view energy infrastructure as critical strategic terrain. The attack reinforced a fundamental lesson for the United States. Protecting sea lanes is not optional. The Caribbean was not a secondary theater. It was a logistical artery. After Aruba and Operation Neuland, convoy systems expanded rapidly. Anti-submarine patrol networks stretched from Florida to South America. Coordination between the Navy, Army Air Forces, and Allied governments intensified. The United States learned that maritime security must be layered. Surface ships, aircraft, intelligence, and industrial resilience working together. That lesson carried forward into every major conflict that followed. Aruba also demonstrated something powerful. Industrial resilience matters as much as firepower. The refinery was attacked, and it kept running. That resilience blunted German strategic objective. Throughout the war, American and Allied industry proved remarkably adaptable. Ships were replaced faster than they could be sunk. Damaged facilities were repaired in days. Production surged despite attacks. The attack on Aruba fits into that broader pattern of industrial endurance. The strike also reinforced hemispheric defense cooperation. The United States increased coordination with Dutch authorities and Caribbean territories. Airfields expanded. Naval bases grew. Intelligence sharing improved. The Western Hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere was no longer viewed as isolated from global war, as insulated from global war. It was integrated into it. When you zoom out, Aruba fits a larger rhythm of the Atlantic campaign. German initiative, Allied shock, rapid adaptation, and strategic stability. We saw it on the U.S. East Coast. We saw it in the Caribbean. We saw it in the mid-Atlantic air gap. And each time, the Allies adjusted. The attack on Aruba was one chapter in the larger story of learning and resilience.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned it a few times previously, but there were Dutch authorities that were in charge of the island. But the Dutch themselves, the Netherlands, was occupied since at least 1940, I think, and would continue to be so, I think, through the end of the European campaign. So I'm sure they felt even more patriotic or willing to help the Allied cause because their homeland was under the subjugation of the Nazis. I do appreciate coordination and adaptability, and when you talk about the lifeblood of the military effort being petroleum, I wonder what that is today. So petroleum no doubt has its place, and running everything that we do practically, with the exception of probably nuclear-powered vessels. But I have to imagine because of the implementation of just various integrated circuits and, what am I trying to say? The miniaturization of computational technology and everything, even missiles, the ships. I have to imagine microchips would be similar today. So it's another pipeline of a commodity that is necessary to keep the war effort running. And I'm wondering if another conflict arises, if that'll be the key choke point of sorts. You know what I mean?
Just as a note about your nuclear vessels not using petroleum, that is
Yes.
false.
Oh, okay.
You got to understand, if you have to scram a reactor, there goes your power source, right?
Right.
There's called backups.
Oh, yeah.
Those are emergency diesel generators, which run on...
Diesel fuel, which is petroleum. I got you.
And there's also, like for aircraft carriers for existence, what do aircraft carriers' main thing?
The aviation wing plus the
aircraft.
fuel.
So you have to have fuel, which is JP5.
Hold on, I think I got this. Second happy time.
Petroleum.
Sorry, that was the other answer. Golly.
So even if you got a nuclear boat, you're still going to have petroleum.
I was thinking more like a submarine, but I imagine they have backups also, and it's the same situation.
Diesel generators.
Yep. Okay, so yeah, it's the same today.
And also, oil is petroleum based.
Yes.
All your machinery needs oil.
I guess we probably don't use whale blubber anymore.
No.
That time has passed. Hey, we're saving the whales.
Most of us are.
I guess I'm not actively doing so, but I'm also not harming them actively.
The attack on Aruba lasted only hours, but its meaning stretched far beyond that February night in 1942. It revealed something essential about modern war. There are no safe peripherals. Aruba was thousands of miles from Berlin, far from London, far from Washington, and yet it was central to the war. Why? Because modern warfare is not defined by geography. It is defined by logistics. Fuel refined on a small Caribbean island powered aircraft over Europe. Tankers crossing tropical waters sustained fleets in the Atlantic. The front line was wherever supply chains existed. Aruba proved that. The attack also underscores a recurring theme in naval history. Preparedness is tested when least expected. In early 1942, the Caribbean was not fully defended. Convoys were incomplete. Air patrol coverage was thin. Germany exploited that window. But that window did not stay open long. The United States and its allies rapidly adapted. Convoys expanded, air patrols intensified, coastal defenses strengthened. And just as on the East Coast, the easy victories ended. That pattern, shock, adjustment, stabilization, defined the Atlantic War. The attack on Aruba reminds us that energy infrastructure remains strategic. Refineries, pipelines, shipping lanes, they are not just economic assets. They are instruments of national power. In 1942, a submarine's det gun targeted oil tanks. Today, threats may look different, but the principle remains the same. Protect the supply chain, protect the sea lanes, protect the infrastructure that sustains a nation's strength. For Aruba, the attack became part of its identity. A small island stood in the path of global war and endured. For the merchant sailors, it was one more chapter in the dangerous, under-recognized service they performed. For the U.S. Navy, it was another hard-earned lesson in global maritime security. The attack on Aruba is not as famous as Midway. It does not dominate textbooks, but it tells us something vital about the Atlantic War. Victory was not won only in grand fleet engagements. It was secured in ports, refineries, escort patrols, and convoy routes. It was secured by protecting the mundane but essential: fuel, shipping, supply. Without Aruba's oil, Allied air power suffers. Without tankers, armies stall. Without adaptation, the war stretches longer. On that February night in 1942, the Caribbean sky glowed with fire. By the morning, the refinery still stood. The oil still flowed. And the Atlantic lifeline remained intact. Sometimes history turns not on total destruction, but on resilience. We end each of our episodes by honoring one of our fallen angels with HeroCards.us. And today we want to honor Specialist Robert E. Hall, Jr. His hometown was Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Served with the U.S. Army, C Company, 467th Engineer Battalion, U.S. Army Reserve, Greenland, Mississippi. He received the Bronze Star and Purple Heart, as well as the Army Commendation Medal. His date of sacrifice was June 28, 2005. Killed in action in Ad Dujal, Iraq. He was 30. Specialist Robert E. Hall, Jr. grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and graduated from North Hill High School in 1973, where he played soccer. He enlisted in the Army Reserve in 1997 and served for 3 years until his discharge in 2000. In his civilian life, Hall started a family and worked as a driver for a waste management company. Hall remained available for duty as part of the Army's Individual Ready Reserve. According to the U.S. Army's Reserve, the IRR are trained soldiers who may be called upon, if needed, to replace soldiers on active duty in Army Reserve units. Many of the soldiers in the IRR have recently left active duty and still have an Army Reserve commitment. Just 1 month short of ending his 5-year IRR commitment, Specialist Hall was recalled to active duty to fill a vacancy in a Mississippi unit. Despite the difficulty of leaving his wife and 3-year-old daughter, Hall answered the call of duty to serve in Operation Iraqi Freedom. Following the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks on New York's World Trade Center and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., the United States and a coalition of allied nations launched Operation Iraqi Freedom with the goal of removing dictator Saddam Hussein and destroying Iraq's ability to deliver weapons of mass destruction to terrorist groups worldwide. The operation later shifted to a mission of helping the Iraqi people with security, establishing a new system of government, and fostering economic development. Specialist Hall was assigned to the 467th Engineer Battalion, U.S. Army Reserve out of Greenwood, Mississippi, as part of Operation Iraqi Freedom. His unit was sent to a forward base in Ad Dajjal, just 40 miles north of Baghdad, Iraq. On June 28, 2005, after 7 months in Iraq, Specialist Hall was guarding his base's entry gate when a suicide bomber drove up and detonated a car bomb. Hall, at age 30, was killed in the blast. For his devotion to duty and willingness to serve his country, Specialist Robert E. Hall, Jr. was awarded the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and an Army Commendation Medal. So, Specialist Robert E. Hall, Jr., we thank you.
Thank you.
All right, take us out.
All right, we'll do. Hey, everybody. I hope you learned something today. I certainly did. And, man, I love it. I hope you at least like it. You don't have to love it, but come back. Learn some more stuff. If you would like to get a hold of us and let us know, hey, I really like that episode, or, you know what, my family's from Aruba, and we work in the oil industry and have for generations, and I know exactly what you're talking about, let us know. And there's a couple of different ways you can do that. So first of all, you can email us. The email address is usnavyhistorypodcast@gmail.com. We are also on X Twitter, which the handle of that is @USNHistoryPod. Yes, I had to look up into my mental space to make sure I was spelling that right. Yes, USNHistoryPod. And we also have a Discord server, so feel free to jump on that. You can find that in the show notes. And in there, we are there, Dale and myself, as well as some other listeners. You can laugh and share and ask questions and hopefully get questions answered. Who knows? And beyond that, I want to thank you for listening again. And if you like what you heard and you know somebody else that might like it too, please share it with them. We go over the statistics right before every episode, and we see the growth, and I'm blown away that people from countries that I can't even imagine traveling to, I was like, wow, I wish I could go there and meet the people that are listening to this podcast and shake their hand and say thank you. So thank you for sharing. Continue to rate us if you get a chance, leave a comment. That all helps. That helps us get this out to more people, and we appreciate what you're doing for us. Thank you very much.
And with that, we're going to wish you fair winds and following seas. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.